Okay, welcome and thank you, virtual viewers, for tuning in to our symposium titled Moving Beyond the DSM-5, Leading Experts Outline and Discuss Cutting-Edge Alternatives. My name is Sarah Kamens, and I will be your friendly chair for the symposium today. Thanks so much to Dr. Jonathan Raskin for your work envisioning and organizing this event, which is a collaboration between Division 32, the Society for Humanistic Psychology, Division 12, the Society of Clinical Psychology, and Division 39, which is Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology. Division 32 has been addressing the evolution of clinical diagnosis for at least 10 years now, since the DSM-5 was being developed in 2011. At the time, we had an open letter committee that was tasked with addressing concerns with DSM-5 development. Since that time, we've worked on identifying alternative models and, more recently, creating dialogues among pluralistic voices in the field of diagnosis. This symposium that you're going to hear today is a direct outcome of those efforts. This is also a very special and timely event for several reasons. First and foremost, our understanding of what diagnosis is and what it might become is vastly different today than it was in decades past. In the 80s and into the 90s, there was enthusiasm and hope surrounding the prospects of the criterion-based categorical model presented in the DSM-3. It's also worth noting that the 90s were known as the decade of the brain, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around neuroscientific technology at that time. What happened next, slowly at first, seemed to follow philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn's recipe for a paradigm crisis almost to a T. First, anomalous findings emerged that increasingly put the current paradigm into question. More specifically, these findings indicated that diagnostic categories had highly comorbid phenotypes, fuzzy boundaries or symptom overlap, and were also genotypically or biologically heterogeneous. Researchers began to believe that DSM definitions did not, as Plato would have it, cut nature at its joints or represent true disorder categories found in nature. Notably, clinical scientists began to predict a paradigm shift, Kuhn's term for a revolutionary change in scientific worldview. That shift has not yet occurred, and yet we still use the DSM in hospitals, clinics, and practices across the country and globe. Notably, Kuhn did not think that a paradigm shift had to follow or necessarily followed a paradigm crisis. Sometimes scientists find that the current faltering paradigm or imperfect paradigm is the best they have at the time and continue to labor under it. The exploration of potential replacements for and/or improvements of the current paradigm is part of making that determination. And indeed, in recent years, a variety of potential augmented and new models, both supplements and alternatives to the DSM, have been in development. And that is part of what makes our symposium today so interesting. Our goal is to share these models with you and what will be a very unique historical moment to put the creators of these models into dialogue with each other. So here is a brief breakdown of what you will see and hear today. First, Dr. Sarah Morris will present on the National Institute of Mental Health's Research Domain Criteria, or RDoC project. Next, Dr. Robert Kruger will present on a hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology consortium. Dr. Robert Gordon will be next with a presentation on the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, version 2. And last but not least, we will hear from Dr. Lucy Johnstone, who will describe the power of threat meaning framework. We will then hear from two discussants, Dr. Michael First and Dr. Jonathan Raskin. And before each presentation and discussion, I will briefly introduce each presenter or discussant in more detail. And then at the very end, we will have 15 minutes for Q&A among everyone involved. So without further ado, I would like to turn the table over to Dr. Sarah Morris, and I'm going to give a brief introduction before I do so. Sarah Morris, PhD, is Chief of the Adult Psychopathology and Psychosocial Interventions Research Branch of the NIMH Division of Translational Research and Associate Head of the Research Domain Criteria Unit. Dr. Morris earned her BA in psychology from Scripps College and her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she studied the processing of emotional and auditory stimuli and error detection in schizophrenia using psychophysiological methods. She completed a clinical internship at the West Los Angeles VA Medical Center and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center at the Baltimore VA Medical Center. Following her fellowship, Dr. Morris joined the faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She also served as director of the VA Maryland Healthcare System, University of Maryland, Baltimore Psychology Internship Consortium. Her research focused on learning, reward processing, and self-monitoring in schizophrenia using event-related brain potentials and on remediation of cognitive deficits in schizophrenia. She joined the NIMH in 2010 as a program officer for the Schizophrenia Spectrum Disorders Program, and now leads a branch which manages a portfolio of grant applications and funded grants focused on translational research and adult psychopathology. Dr. Morris also co-leads the RDoC effort to promote research that explores novel methods to classify mental disorders and is a program officer for the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Initiative in Schizophrenia. So thank you, Dr. Morris, and please take it away.
Thank you very much. Great, and thank you for including me and including RDoC in this very interesting symposium. So today I'm going to give an overview of the Research Domain Criteria Project, or RDoC, and a brief update, and discuss some example data coming out of the initiative. So first off, as Sarah touched on already, there are many problems with our current diagnostic procedures and criteria. First, starting with those that are experienced by patients and their families, we know that patients may receive multiple diagnoses over time, that diagnoses provide only modest information about prognosis, and there's room for improvement in that area. We know treatment is trial and error and often results in delay in achieving good treatment outcomes. And also in the DSM, distress is a major symptom for most categories, but distress varies from day to day, and the reporting of stress can be very situationally dependent. So these are issues for clinical practice. Of course, many clinicians function in a very transdiagnostic way already and treat the presenting symptoms as they are in front of them with any individual patient. But arguably, these issues about diagnosis are even greater in the scientific area, where the current diagnostic systems remain really based on clinical symptoms and self-report. They have achieved some degree of reliability, and not to underestimate the impact that that has had on psychiatry as a research field. It has allowed the development of a science of psychiatry, but arguably that's been achieved at the expense of diagnostic validity for the reasons that Sarah mentioned already. Most of our DSM disorders are broad syndromes with a lot of heterogeneity and comorbidity and high use of an NOS diagnosis. Disorders are treated in research as distinct categories very often, implying a healthy-sick dichotomy that perhaps doesn't reflect reality. And resulting from these issues, there's been a failure over decades to establish biomarkers for different disease categories. And perhaps most worrisome, that these issues have diluted perhaps treatment effects and led to failures in new clinical trials and new treatment development that may be avoided if we had more precise ways of identifying and classifying individuals. So despite these shortcomings, the diagnostic categories have really driven the whole research and clinical systems, grant reviews, journal procedures or policies, clinical trials, and regulatory approvals. And so about 10 years ago, NIMH launched the RDoC initiative with the goal of, in a sense, unwriting an unwritten rule. And the unwritten rule had really been to get funding to do clinical research from NIMH, a grant application had to specify what DSM category it was going to focus on. Reviewers looked for that, and so did the NIMH. But the idea of RDoC is that the DSM shouldn't define the boundaries of the area of research that NIMH supports, and need not impact every research hypothesis, that we should be open to other new ways of examining different classifications. So again, sort of unwriting that unwritten rule that NIMH research needed to focus on DSM categories. And so the RDoC framework was proposed and developed in a series of workshops, again, about 10 years ago. And it consists of a matrix of different domains listed here, negative valence, positive valence, and so on, with the more recent addition of a sensory motor systems domain that can be measured across different units of analysis, from the genetic to the molecular, circuit-based measures, physiology, behavior, and self-report, with the goal of placing those on an equal footing. So RDoC domains emerge from everything that we know now about behavioral neuroscience, but the idea is that no one way of measuring anything is more valid or real or true than other ways of measuring them. And that's why we do refer to them as units of analysis rather than levels of analysis, suggesting that any one is more fundamental than the other would be a mistake. So this framework all exists in the context of lifespan human development and in acknowledgement that that environmental impacts play an important role. So with the goal of moving toward precision diagnosis, treatment, and prevention, long-term goal is to move away from one-size-fits-all diagnoses with their heterogeneity and comorbidity toward dimensional transdiagnostic mechanisms, using a new set of strategic principles to invert the usual clinical paradigm. Instead of starting with a DSM disorder and throwing the tools of modern research at it to try to understand it, instead starting with what we know about normal adaptive processes and figuring out where things go wrong to result in psychopathology. So looking again at that normal to abnormal dimension, ideally in a developmental way to inform early intervention, relying on data-driven functional constructs that are jointly defined by behavior and implementing neural circuits. And then more recently, an emphasis on computational approaches in acknowledgement that the data are sometimes more complicated than we can interpret with the naked eye. And computational approaches can help us derive parameters out of multidimensional data that can be informative. So again, RDoC is a set of principles, a framework for research. It's not in and of itself a diagnostic system ready for clinical use at this time, but the idea is to support and stimulate the research that would lead to new and improved ways of classifying patients based on fundamental components that may span multiple disorders, looking again at that full range of variation, using the most reliable and valid measures of these components, and integrating across different units of analysis. So to move away from what's depicted here in figure A and B, a case control comparison suggesting a bright line between patients and controls, or arguably even worse, research approach comparing cases versus super controls and ignoring all of the variability in between, and instead moving towards something more like what's depicted in C, with an emphasis on quantitative traits that span a dimension. So by way of status update, this is a list of the different funding opportunity announcements that NIMH has published focused on RDoC. There are 15 of them. Some of them have been issued and reissued over time. We started with a series of 5 R01 announcements to really try to get the work going, and then have had more specialized announcements as time goes on. Most recently with these 2 computational funding announcements, and then one focused on positive valence systems related to suicide. So we've funded just over 100 grants from these funding opportunity announcements. And the last time I checked, there were over 600 publications that cited these research grants. And then of course, in the broader portfolio of NIMH, we funded many more grants that have an RDoC focus, but weren't necessarily funded under one of these funding opportunity announcements. Looking just at the portfolio in the Division of Translational Research at NIMH, which is arguably the most relevant for RDoC, about 1/3 of the grants that we fund are ones that we would classify as RDoC, and then another third implement some principles of RDoC, and then the remaining take a more traditional approach to diagnosis. And if you want to see a list of the grants that have been funded under these RDoC funding opportunity announcements, it is available on the website. It's a little hard to find, but at the bottom of this page, you can find a link launched from the RDoC website. So I just wanted to show one illustration of the idea, one of the RDoC principles of starting with the brain and focusing on specific clinical problems instead of diverse syndromes. These are data from the Penn neurodevelopmental study. 663 young people oversampled for a wide range of psychiatric symptoms. They identified distinct patterns of connectivity between brain areas and found that each of these 4 dimensions, labeled A, B, C, and D, map onto clinical features that cluster in reasonable ways. But the dimensions are also associated from psychopathology outside of that area. So for example, the blue dimension A is associated with a lot of mood-related symptoms, but also persecutory ideas and an OCD symptom. So these data-driven dimensions of psychopathology align with clinical phenomenology, but in a dimensional way that doesn't adhere to discrete categories. So I'm showing this data at the risk of reinforcing the misunderstanding that RDoC is reductionistic. To be clear, this isn't to say that every type of psychopathology will have a unique signal in the brain or that only those that do are worthy of study. Rather, RDoC argues that our approach to studying and classifying mental disorders should be informed by all that we know about behavioral neuroscience. But the tools of neuroscience have their limitations, and there are those who argue that the brain is overrated as a way of understanding human behavior and experience. This really thought-provoking paper by Alex Gomez-Marin makes the argument where he reminds us that understanding neural circuits and connectomics may not get us much closer to understanding human minds, just like climbing a tall tree isn't the first step to reaching the moon. But biological signals provide important clues and are among many reasonable validators of novel classification approaches. So finally, just briefly about clinical trials. RDoC is implemented in our clinical trials funding announcements, and we're encouraging applications to take an operationally defined, empirically supported approach to defining functional domains or symptoms, as opposed to broad diagnostic categories, in order to maximize the probability that subjects share the same mechanism of disorder. So in the next decade of RDoC, we'll be thinking about how best to incorporate developmental and environmental elements. What have we learned from RDoC studies so far? Do we need to do more elaboration of the RDoC matrix or less elaboration of the matrix? We want to be clear that the RDoC matrix, which is available on the website, is meant to be a set of exemplars of ways of measuring different RDoC constructs and not meant to be a limitation on research. Perhaps it's best to do away with the matrix, but that might be premature. And we continue to pursue partnerships with the FDA and other regulatory agencies to move forward with new types of treatment indications. So really the question is not, will RDoC give us useful information compared to a more traditional clinical approach? The question is, what kinds of analyses and tests will provide precision assessment across the range, prescriptive assignment to treatment, and preventive interventions, all in the interest of achieving a precision medicine approach to mental disorders with all its complexity. So I will stop there, and I look forward to hearing comments from my colleagues and attendees.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. We will have time for Q&A at the end of all of the presentations. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next presentation by Dr. Robert Kruger. Dr. Robert Kruger is Distinguished Knight University Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. He has authored numerous scholarly publications in areas such as personality disorders, psychopathology, psychometrics, genetics, and health, and has been named a highly cited researcher by the Web of Science group. He was the lead author of the Personality Inventory for DSM-5 and a founder of the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology Consortium. He has been the recipient of major awards, including the Hawk Award from the American Psychopathological Association and the Theodore Millon Award from the American Psychological Foundation. He is the current co-editor of the Journal of Personality Disorders and the chairperson of the U.S. NIH/CSR Social Personality and Interpersonal Processes Study Section. So without further ado, Dr. Kruger, please take it away.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the HiTOP or Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology Consortium today, and a little bit of the background on how this whole thing got started. So the consortium was founded by myself and Roman Kotov, who's at Stony Brook, and David Watson, who's at Notre Dame. And basically what happened was the three of us were chatting at a meeting and realized that there were a lot of people who were interested in an approach to psychopathology that would be based more on data than some of the other approaches that you've heard, sort of described already today. And one way of thinking about this in sort of a socio-historical way, right, is this work that Roger Blatchfield did before he retired. This was very inspiring work to me, right? So I read a lot of Roger's stuff when I was in graduate school and thought about how there are these different sort of, sort of sub-paradigms that emerge within fields, right? So we talked earlier in this session about a paradigm shift. But the way that Roger sort of saw the field organized is that there's an approach that's based more on kind of traditional clinical description, and then that description of various patients you encounter leads to, specified criteria and so on. And he described this as an approach that's based sort of on authority, and that's epitomized by kind of the neo-Krapelinian movement that then shows up in DSM-3 and sort of carries forth essentially unchanged in its basic tenets, through the various DSMs. And then parallel to that in the literature is this approach that's based more on kind of quantitative approaches. So all things, of course, begin with clinical observation, but in the quantitative approach, you sort of start with those clinical observations and then use various kinds of quantitative techniques to organize those observations into classificatory rubrics, essentially. So the way HiTOP kind of got started is there's a lot of people in the field, or so we discovered, right, who were interested in kind of working together on this more quantitative approach. Okay. So how is HiTOP structured? So HiTOP is a consortium. That's the best way to understand kind of like how it works or how it came about. There's an executive committee of HiTOP, and that consists of the chairs of the various work groups. And I'll say a little bit about the work groups, right? So HiTOP now consists of 200 plus people, right? So it's, even though I'm a founding member and I continue to serve as a work group chair, it's hard for me to continually keep track of everything that everybody's doing because it's kind of become this sort of distributed kind of network of people who are interested in similar things. But nevertheless, there are work groups focused on DEI issues, right? That's been very active lately. Quantitative methods that are relevant to psychopathology, the role of personality in psychopathology, a group that's focused on utility. So, for example, if you were interested in the HiTOP kind of approach for a particular kind of question, how could you use it? The clinical applications group has been very active lately. I'm not intimately involved with everything they're doing, but it's been amazing to watch the growth of that, right? They have these many clinics that are now connected with HiTOP where people are using, sort of measures that have been developed through the HiTOP effort and organizing sort of data and ways of using these kinds of conceptions in, sort of clinical application. There are measures being developed in the measurement work group. They had a series of papers that just appeared in the literature, I think in the journal Assessment. The neurobiology work group has been very active. I'll show you one slide from that work group next. Genetics has published a number of papers sort of taking this approach, including, pretty compelling evidence that the structure of genomic risk for psychopathology resembles the phenotypic structure that HiTOP has sort of converged on. A revisions work group, that's been super interesting, right? So a number of the sort of younger involvements in HiTOP have asked a really challenging question, which is how do you avoid this thing becoming as reified as other approaches arguably have become? Right, so how do you take a principled approach to revising something as the data come in? And so that's been really interesting to watch people think about kind of how to take a principled approach to the revision of an existing kind of system. And the work group focused also on development. And if you're interested in this approach, the one good introduction is this paper that we just published in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology. There's a lot of different papers coming out from HiTOP. As I said, it's been very sort of dispersed in terms of the effort, like lots of people doing a lot of things. We did have this opportunity to kind of write this overview that's fairly up to date. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about and you want to kind of read more, this would be a good place to turn. Okay. So what is this HiTOP business anyway, right? The idea in HiTOP is to basically take the essence of the things that are described in approaches like the DSM and the ICD and organize them based more on empirical patterns of covariation, right? And so we can talk at length about, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of that approach, but the amazing thing is that so many people have been interested in kind of seeing like what you get when you do that. So it is something that's very tractable, right? You can do this using existing data, and you converge on things that are not entirely foreign from the perspective of what's being described in things like the DSM, but arguably it kind of tries to refine clinical description based on more evidence having a greater role in kind of organizing the rubrics. So at the bottom of this slide are kind of existing DSM rubrics, and as we've been discussing today, right, those are organized into sort of these putatively discrete and distinctive, or at least distinguishable kind of categories. And the idea in HiTOP is that, well, in the presence of all this evidence, that those things aren't quite as discrete or quite as easily distinguished as maybe was suggested in the original conceptualization, right? The kind of neo-Kraepelinian approach that led to DSM-3. Instead, you could sort of start with now moving up to the HiTOP part of the figure, the symptom components and sort of the maladaptive traits. Those then yield empirical syndromes, and then you get kind of these broad classificatory rubrics that are not entirely different from DSM to kind of shuffle these things around a little bit, right? So you see elements within these broader spectra. So in terms of sort of the broad spectrum that seem to emerge from the data, there's a kind of a broad internalizing spectrum that encompasses things like sexual problems, eating pathology, fear and distress, a thought disorder spectrum that encompasses essentially the essence of the positive symptoms of psychotic kinds of experiences, a detachment spectrum that's sort of like low extroversion, a disinhibited form of externalizing and a kind of antagonistic form of externalizing. So again, those aren't rubrics that are entirely different from what you sort of see in being theorized clinically, but arguably the data are showing something that says, well, instead of that whole domain of psychopathological experience being organized into discrete and readily distinguishable categories, they kind of fall into these larger spectrums of variation, and variation within those spectrums is itself more dimensional than discrete. And then at the highest order level, you see sort of a broad emotional dysfunction spectrum, a psychosis spectrum, and kind of an externalizing spectrum. And those three broad super spectra have been sort of useful organizing rubrics for the consortium. So we have papers that have been published or that are in press at the journal World Psychiatry that are organized by kind of those three broad rubrics with a lot of evidence about why they're conceptually coherent, right? So instead of thinking about discrete and distinguishable kinds of psychosis and arguing at length about whether a patient would meet criteria for schizophrenia as opposed to schizoaffective and so on and so forth, the idea is that that's not necessarily the most useful thing, you know, for sort of science and clinical practice, but rather we want to understand the person's position within a broader psychosis continuum. And then those things are themselves correlated, giving rise to this broad P factor or sort of general overall risk for psychopathology that's been a core topic of interest in the literature recently. So how do you use this kind of thing if you want to try to understand correlates? This is a figure from the neurobiology work group. the basic logic is that you're trying to sort of interweave phenotypic clinical description with data that are coming from other modalities. So at the top of the figure is kind of the high top idea. And then what you would do, right, if you want to sort of use this, is assess a population and then understand how different kinds of variables that are in the domain you're studying, for instance, neurobiological variation, are linked to the different levels of the hierarchy. So if you're studying some kind of brain correlate, is it something that's linked to a specific symptom or trait? Is it linked to a broader spectrum, and so on and so forth? So you see the idea here, hopefully, right? It's that all these things that one might study, genetic variation, neurobiological variation, and so on, are assumed to be interwoven with kind of phenotypic description. And it's that interplay of what we're seeing in the clinic, right, the phenotypic description, and what we can do with other kinds of modalities, neuroscience assessments, and so on, that kind of frames the work that people are interested in doing under the sort of consortium rubric. Okay. And I wanted to present just a quick overview of a specific empirical study to kind of hopefully flesh out the idea of a hierarchy, since that's something that that if you're not sort of working in this vein, you may or may not be familiar with. So I'll just present a little data from this project that we did. This is using data from the Rhode Island Hospital Methods to Improve Diagnostic Assessment and Services project. This is Mark Zimmerman's project at Rhode Island Hospital, and it's an amazing thing that Mark has managed to accomplish, right? Everybody who comes through presenting to a community outpatient psychiatric practice is carefully diagnosed using a SCID and a SIDP, right, which is an Axis 2, used to be personality disorders kind of interview. And what I'm going to look at here, just to illustrate the idea of hierarchy, are these DSM-4 derived indicators. So if we even sort of start with the sort of classical approach, let's call it, can we understand how those data are organized into these broad spectrums of variation by thinking about them more hierarchically? So sex, educational level, and marital status distributions are similar to what one might expect, given the sort of catchment area, so to speak, of people who are presenting with this kind of practice. And there's some diversity in race, but not heavy diversity, given that this has occurred in Rhode Island in terms of the sort of data collection. So again, I won't get into the technical details, but the idea here is, can we use sort of evidence on the patterns of co-occurrence of DSM disorders to kind of get a sense of how they might be organized into these broad spectrums of variation? So for those who are sort of quantitative aficionados, this was a hierarchical agglomerative kind of approach. And what we're looking at basically is the association among the disorders, how correlated they are with each other. So correlation's, I think, an important concept here, right? Comorbidity could mean a lot of different things. If two things are comorbid, it could be that they have high base rates. So what we're looking at here is things co-occur at rates that are greater than the product, essentially, of the base rates, right? So things are tending to go together more than you would expect by chance. Okay. So the traditional cluster analytic approach presents something like this dendrogram, but what we're interested in here is kind of, as we move up these levels of classification, what kind of rubrics do we get? Like, what kind of classificatory ideas emerge from examining empirically how these disorders tend to go together? So here's the disorders that were studied, right? These have labels that should generally be familiar, right? So ASPD is antisocial, and PTSD is, well, post-traumatic stress disorder. So hopefully most of these abbreviations are familiar. We can talk about them if you have any questions. And if you look at the 7 cluster level, you kind of get these 7 groupings, and we can give them names, right? Like disinhibition, antagonism, which includes ASPD and borderline and so on, somatoform disorders, a kind of detachment spectrum, which is interesting, involving sort of schizoid presentations, a thought disorder spectrum involving positive symptoms of schizophrenia and manic kinds of symptoms, an OCD cluster, and kind of a broad internalizing cluster. So again, the reason I'm presenting this is to try to give some sense of the concept of hierarchy. So as we move up the classification hierarchy, what we see is that thought disorder wants to coalesce at the level of 6 clusters. As we move to 5 clusters, the sort of eating disorder and OCD stuff wants to go with the other internalizing presentations. Moving up to 4 clusters, we get a broader externalizing spectrum that joins together the antagonistic and disinhibited parts of this, right? So things like antisocial are arguably about being antagonistic, and things like substance use problems are arguably about being disinhibited, and those come together in this broader externalizing spectrum. And then at the 3 level, we get those 3 sort of broad groups that have been a big focus of thinking within the HITOP consortium and that organize those papers that I mentioned that we have at World Psychiatry, right? So at kind of this very broad level, psychopathology, I mean, we pretty much think can be well conceived of in terms of these 3 broad spectrums, right? A kind of acting out or externalizing spectrum, a kind of internalizing spectrum involving what are classically called anxiety and mood disorders, and a kind of thought disorder spectrum that involves, again, positive kinds of symptoms that are generally associated with schizophrenia and related DSM concepts. At the 2 cluster level, you sort of have externalizing and everything else. And there is evidence in this data set for the broad kind of P factor or overall psychopathology. So hopefully that illustration, right, of how these things kind of come together empirically helps to explain the idea of hierarchy, right? So there are various things that you can do when you sort of think about the world in this way, but one of the things that I think people involved in the consortium have found productive is, instead of trying to split diagnoses based on all these detailed considerations that are described in things like the DSM, recognizing that there are a lot of shared features, and that when we think about these broad spectrums of psychopathology, we have something sort of compelling as a target to study from all of these different kinds of angles, such as neurobiology and so on and so forth. So hopefully I've made the case that hierarchy is a meaningful construct in understanding psychopathology structure. And as I mentioned, HITOP is very active. People are joining all the time. If you're interested in this, it's a simple matter to get involved. You can just send me an email, and we ask for sort of a statement of your interest in it and a CV. And it's been pretty fun, I have to say, right? I worried a little bit when this all kind of got rolling that it would be like herding cats, right? Because you've got different people and their egos and their different approaches and their different styles and so on. But really, it's been kind of exciting to watch people get enthusiastic about working together to kind of realize the potential in this way of thinking about how psychopathology is organized. So there's a lot of activity. As I said, I've been impressed with the clinical group in particular, sort of articulating things that I think are really practical, right, for when you encounter a patient, sort of issues like telescoping for specialty versus generalist care. And in the more sort of research realm, understanding biological correlates at different levels of generality versus specificity. So if you have a compelling and well-measured biological variable, is that associated with risk for psychopathology overall, or with a specific kind of syndrome, or even with a specific kind of symptom cluster? You can kind of articulate questions like that if you're sort of thinking about the world in this hierarchical kind of way. And, you know, recently it's been exciting to see the DEI group take off. I've thought a lot about that in recent years, given the way that that's been such an important issue in academia and in our society overall. And it's been exciting to watch people in that group sort of think through what are the advantages of a more sort of dimensional hierarchical approach to describing the problems that people come into the clinic with. And arguably that reduces emphasis on potentially stigmatizing kinds of categorical labels and increases emphasis on, well, this is a profile of issues that you're dealing with, and this is a profile of ways that you're trying to deal and cope with those issues. And how can we kind of think more, I guess, hopefully constructively about a kind of profile of presentations instead of thinking in terms of more sort of potentially reifying categorical diagnoses. Okay, that's what I have to say. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kruger. And again, we're going to have time for all the presenters to enter into dialogue towards the end of our program today. I'm just going to introduce our next presenter. Okay, so it is an honor to introduce Dr. Robert Gordon. Dr. Robert Gordon is a diplomat of clinical psychology and a diplomat of psychoanalysis, and served on the governing council of the American Psychological Association. He was president of the Pennsylvania Psychological Association and received its Distinguished Service Award. He was elected honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He authored many scholarly articles and books in the areas of ethics, the MMPI-2, psychotherapy, relationships, forensic psychology, personality assessment, diagnoses, and the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. He was a PDM2 editor and researcher and co-author of the psychodiagnostic chart, which is used for the PDM2. So Dr. Gordon, you can go ahead and take it away.
Well, okay. This is on the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. Actually, Nancy McWilliams wanted to call this the Diagnostic Manual for Practitioners. She didn't want people to feel that there'll be a psychodynamic bias in terms of rigidity. Basically, what we wanted was a diagnostic manual that would best inform psychotherapy practitioners. It is essentially a developmental theoretical model within complexity theory. What I mean by complexity theory is as though I'll be presenting construct as though it looks linear, but it's hard to present a complexity theory on PowerPoint where the variables are actually interdependent and interacting. This is a study I did first surveying experts. Could you see that slide all right? 61 experts, 80% had doctorates, 44% psychodynamic, 15% CBT. That's not usually found with psychotherapy practitioners, but when it comes to assessment people, that's not unusual. And we asked them after presenting in workshops what these different diagnostic constructs represented. We asked them how valuable, how clinically useful do they feel it would be in understanding their patients. First one is personality organization.
Someone is at the front door.
Then personality patterns. Let me put this down. Mental functioning, ICD or DSM symptoms, or the cultural or contextual variables. And you could see the most valued with the experts were personality organization, mental functioning, and personality patterns. And then I asked in workshops, series of workshops, when introducing this, we had an N of 438. And more typical of psychotherapists in practice, only 46% had doctorates, most were CBT, and we got the same results, which was, we're very happy with that finding, obviously, that even with the typical practitioners, and this is what we were aiming for, a diagnostic system that had high clinical utility for the average practitioner, regardless of their theoretical orientation. Personality organization was one of the highest ones, and so was mental functioning, something that's rarely mentioned. The first axis of the PDM is on personality, but it's not a disorder, it's a syndrome. We all have unique aspects to our personalities, and it's on a continuum. If you listen to the presenters today, you would be assured that they have to have some degree of OCD. They wouldn't be doing this kind of research so productively and so carefully. But I will assume none of it is on the neurotic level because we get stuff done. And it certainly isn't on the borderline level where we get nothing done and blame everybody else for it. So we all have personalities. We all have personality types. It's just a matter of degree. You can see the overlap between the ICD-10, which is a bottom-up system, the DSM-5, more top-down, and the PDM, which has to do with evidence-based, looking at cases and looking at empirical research as well as theory. We do have some differences. We went back to the old term, psychopathic instead of antisocial. That's very helpful to me as a forensic psychologist. Depressive personality was thrown around for a while, but we have to realize that 100% of the people on the mood disorder committee on DSM had financial ties to Big Pharma, and the depressive personality does not respond to psychotropics It responds more to intensive psychotherapy. Somatization is another one we saw as a personality syndrome, not just a symptom. And sadistic personality, that often combines with this psychopathic personality. You don't see that in private practice. A lot of models are based on people who present for psychotherapy or hospitalization. But when you go into prisons, you often see a very different kind of population. So the PDM wanted to be open to a broader range of personality syndromes. I approached Bob Bornstein in 2011. I'm more an expert on the MMPI, he's an expert on the Rorschach. I said, you know, if we don't operationalize the PDM, people aren't going to use it. And it's got to be easy. So that was our challenge, to have something that is just 2 to 3 pages long and it can be operationalized. And here's the hierarchy, although keep in mind, this is interdependent and interactive. One affects the other. They're not really independent variables. First, we assess personality organization, then personality patterns, mental functioning, symptoms, and then qualify it based on cultural and contextual issues. Here's the form that's used in the PDM2. And what I did was a stepwise regression equation with a large number of practitioners. And we asked them to rate people's severity. And then we looked at the various variables from mental functions. And we found the variables that accounted for most of the variance. These 4, and I wanted to keep it down to the least number. We wanted to make it easy to do. So what 4 variables that as little overlap as possible would help us to determine empirically overall personality organization: psychotic, borderline, neurotic, and healthy. I came out with these 4. Interesting, I found out it completely validated Otto Kernberg's work on personality organization, where he developed purely on a theoretical basis, looking at identity integration. For example, the borderline has a very diffuse identity. A healthier person has an identity where they can identify symptoms, but basically there's a self that has continuity through relationships and through moods and over time. Object relations, the capacity for mutually rewarding healthy relationships. That's on a continuum, a very important variable to help us to understand personality organization. Level of defense, I often talk about the difference between suppression, repression, and denial. Suppression on the healthy level is we get disturbed by things and we consciously push it away from awareness so we can do our work, and then we could call it up again and take responsibility for our reactions and our behaviors. Repression is it's lost from consciousness, and only with interpretation or a non-threatening confrontation, you could say, hey, look the way you were acting. The person could reduce the repression and have a self-awareness. With denial, it never happens. If you ever do couples therapy like I've had, with one person is using denial, the person who uses repression or suppression may as well be banging their head against the wall. And oftentimes they need an education that the more you confront someone with denial, the worse you make the situation. So it's a very healthy, it's a very helpful way to understand the levels of defensive functioning when we understand the degree of personality organization. And finally is reality testing. How realistic is the person's perception of themselves and the world? And then we have a simple definition at the bottom to help people determine level of personality organization. Here it is again. And how do we use this? One of the most important things I found in my research is not so much the specific symptoms, but the level of personality organization and determining treatment, regardless of whatever treatment it is. Nancy McWilliams, one of the editors of the PDM, pointed out that neurotic level people, people with a neurotic level of personality organization, the best time to make interpretations is usually when they're very emotional and they're less likely to intellectualize. The opposite is true with an extremely typically emotional person like borderline or histrionic personality. You really want to use supportive approaches. And if you're going to interpret things that increase self-awareness, increase reality testing, they really need to more settle down. Now, like many of you found, we do the same kind of research. We did find levels of, when you factor analyze this or cluster analyze it, the same kind of thing of the dimension of internalizing or externalizing. Jonathan Chetler and Drew Western provided a lot of the empirical work on this. And this is in the order of internalizing to externalizing. You can see internalizing syndromes such as depressive, dependent, anxious, obsessive compulsive, schizoid, somatizing. And then we get more to the externalizing, histrionic, narcissistic, paranoid, psychopathic, sadistic. Borderline is a weird thing. In fact, for a while, like the DSM-5 committee, like the ICD-10 committee, we had a lot of controversy about borderline because borderline was brought to DSM-3 as a level of personality organization on the border of neurotic and psychotic. It was not presented as a personality disorder. By DSM-3, there was no longer levels of personality organization. They did away with neurotic and psychotic. So there was no place for borderline. The artifact is they made borderline a personality disorder. When the ICD and the DSM committees try to reframe it as a dysregulated personality disorder, there was a big uproar because it's a cottage industry. You walk into a bookstore and you'll see on the shelf more books on borderline. Was it so difficult for practitioners, for families, for individuals who suffer with this? They weren't about to change it, mainly for marketing reasons. A lot has to do with will people use your system? So this was added on as a personality syndrome. And this talks about, I just mentioned that the internalizing personality type syndromes and the externalizing with borderline stuck on at the end as a combination of both. This is one of my favorite parts, and you really don't see it anywhere else except maybe among humanistic psychologists. And that's something that psychoanalysts have called ego strength for a long time. And there was an area called ego psychology. They have to do with doing analytic work to build up strengths. And you can look at these. I don't have time, obviously, in my presentation to look at strengths, but a lot of the work is building that up. And our assessment is not just on psychopathology, but focusing on various mental strengths and how to build them up and crafting psychotherapy around the idea of person's strengths and weaknesses, not just based on the brand that we identify with. Now, finally, you'll see a section for symptom patterns. There are some institutions you have to put in a DSM-5 diagnosis so you don't get paid, maybe ICD, and maybe any of these wonderful systems that you presented. We did not want a system that was like DSM-4 that said you could only use this one thing. I remember being in court and having an attorney say to me, Dr. Gordon, this is the Bible, isn't it? Referring to the DSM. And I said, no, it's not my Bible. So we're not presenting this as anybody's Bible. If it's helpful, great. If you want to use parts of this that you find useful, sure. And if you want to integrate other systems with this one, go right ahead. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. We will now be moving on to our next presenter, Dr. Lucy Johnstone. Dr. Lucy Johnstone is a consultant clinical psychologist, author of Users and Abusers of Psychiatry, and co-editor of Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy, Making Sense of People's Problems, and A Straight-Talking Guide to Psychiatric Diagnosis, along with a number of other chapters and articles taking a critical perspective on mental health theory and practice. She is the former program director of the Bristol Clinical Psychology Doctorate and was the lead author of Good Practice Guidelines on the Use of Psychological Formulation. She has worked in adult mental health settings for many years, most recently in a service in South Wales. She was lead author, along with Professor Mary Boyle, for the Power Threat Meaning Framework, a division of clinical psychology funded project to outline a conceptual alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. Lucy is an experienced conference speaker and lecturer and currently works as an independent trainer. Her particular interest and expertise is in the use of psychological formulation in both its individual and team versions and in promoting trauma-informed practice. So thank you, Dr. Johnstone, so much for being here, and you can take it away. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, thank you for inviting me here today. And it's appropriate, in fact, that this is the last presentation because it's actually rather different from the previous ones, and it's actually not a new diagnostic system. It's an attempt to move away from the diagnostic paradigm altogether, a step towards that term that Sarah used right at the beginning, a paradigm shift. Although we're not claiming we have produced a paradigm shift, that is the direction in which we are hoping to head. And the paradigm shift we want to see is one towards one that's based on narrative and on an awareness of social issues and the need for social justice rather than on diagnostic and medical understandings. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework was produced and published by members of the Division of Clinical Psychology of the British Psychological Society, and I'm about to give you a fairly brief overview, and I will show you the website address if you're interested in finding out more. The website has the main documents, resources, podcasts, interviews, training materials, and so on. So I hope to manage to give you at least a brief flavour. And if you want to get a more detailed and accessible look at what this framework might look in practice, if you're working with or supporting someone, this book is available from Amazon. This is an accessible, simplified version of the much longer main documents. So these are the contributors to the project over a 5-year period. We're all psychologists in the top group, although Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon identify as survivors of the psychiatric system. So this is unlike the other systems we've heard today. This is a jointly produced, a co-produced document along with survivors of the psychiatric system. And we drew in a number of other groups to help us as we went along our way, ending up with a total project group of about 40. And the framework builds on a strong UK tradition, particularly in clinical psychology, but also to some extent in what is called critical psychiatry in the UK, of challenging diagnosis and promoting non-diagnostic practice, often by arguing for the use of formulation instead, but sometimes in other ways as well. So the essence of the framework is that it's an attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress. It's not an official DCP or BPS model. It's a set of ideas. It's not a manual of how to do this, do it like this. The idea is that we present a set of principles, and we hoped that people would be interested enough to take these forward, to translate them to practice in various ways, to feed back to us, and this in turn would help to further develop the framework. So in a sense, we're in stage 2 of the project. The first stage was the one that led up to publication. The second stage is ongoing. And it's not a replacement for all current models and practices. One of our aims is to offer extra support and validation for the large amount of existing good practice, which isn't based on diagnostic assumptions, but also to offer new ways forward. And it's attracted a great deal of attention. Not all of it positive, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to say it's made an impact. So what this is fundamentally about is moving away from a model designed for understanding our bodies, sometimes referred to as a biomedical model, or some versions of the biopsychosocial model, towards a model that is able to understand people as existing within social and relationship contexts, who are not victims of diseases, illnesses, or disorders, but who are acting and making meanings within their life circumstances. It's optional, no one has to read it, like it, agree with it, do anything with it, but for people who are interested, it suggests some tools for constructing narratives of all kinds, including but wider than formulations, as an alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. And importantly, it's about all of us. It's not about those of us who are given diagnostic labels, not just about that group. We all struggle at times, we live in a difficult world, we all suffer distress at times. We see that very much as something that includes all of us. But similarly, we see the framework as possibly being of use to any of us in our struggles and difficulties, which are part of all our lives. So it's not just about demedicalising, it is also about deprofessionalising both understanding of distress and interventions. So along with fulfilling more effectively the general functions of diagnosis, these are its aims: to recognise that distress is understandable in context, to restore the link between distress and social injustice, to create validating narratives at all sorts of levels, personal, family, group, community, and ultimately to promote social action, because that is where we see the roots of distress as lying. So because it's a very long and complex document, we have tried to hang it on some core questions. Each of these questions is itself based on a great deal of evidence that these are relevant and important questions to ask in understanding distress in all its forms. So these are the 4 questions, and I'm going to take you through them in a minute, one by one. What has happened to you? How did it affect you? What sense did you make of it? What you had to do to survive? And that translates into power, threat, meaning, and threat responses, aspects of your life and your distress. And you may want to add or start with what are your strengths, and to pull it together, what is your story? A story that could be constructed in any way that makes sense to the person or the group or the people you're working with, or who are turning to the framework as a resource. So it's important not to take this too literally. There is no expectation of using these questions exactly in that order, in those words. This is probably going to be an iterative process, and these are areas that need to be considered, and they don't, almost certainly you will find that these questions overlap. They're not separate, this plus this plus this. Aspects of distress, each question implies and leads on to the other. So I'm now going to take you through the questions one by one very briefly. The very important core question is about what has happened to you, how is power operating in your life? The simplest way of summarising the framework is to say that it attempts to shift the core question from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you, which is a slogan you may be familiar with. It's quite a well-known survivor slogan in the UK. So in a sense, the questions expand that slogan, expand the what has happened to you question, and start by looking at power. Now, it is our view that power in all its guises and forms is by definition excluded from diagnostic understandings, but is also absent from many psychotherapeutic and psychological approaches. So the framework is about critiquing those approaches as well, indeed about critiquing any approach which takes, in our view, too narrow and individualistic perspective. So we take power first and forward, and everything else follows from that. There's no need to read all this, but these are some of the forms of power that we consider in great detail in the framework. We have done a 200,000 word overview of the evidence, which you can see on the website if you're interested. But in essence, we think it's very important to address all these forms of power, some of which we're used to thinking about. If we're therapists, we're used to thinking about interpersonal power, for example, the various ways we may hurt and upset and abuse and neglect each other. But we're less used to thinking about some of the other forms of power, particularly ideological power. which has a strong emphasis in the framework, control of language, meaning and perspective. So we've described this as the least visible but most important form of power, because it often takes the form of facts or views or beliefs, often not actually evidence-based, but worldviews, which we accept at a very deep level without question, so that it seems that this is just the way the world is or should be. So, for example, what do we mean in any given culture about being a good mother, about being successful, about a happy family? What stereotypes do we hold about certain groups in society? What language is used to sell these ideas to us? And what personal and political, business and professional interests benefit from that? And in whose interests do they operate? So ideological power is shaped through the social norms and expectations that are all around us, very often to the benefit of those who are already more privileged and to the disadvantage of those who are already less so. So although the framework draws to quite a large extent on trauma-informed practice, we think that it goes beyond that in that it provides a way of understanding distress experienced by people who have not had obvious traumas in their lives, who may in fact have led quite fortunate and materially comfortable lives, but nevertheless suffer very real distress, which can often be seen as a result of perceived failure to live up to all sorts of internalised social expectations and so on. In the mental health and the criminal justice system, ideological power is used often to turn social problems into individual ones via labels of mad or bad or both. And here's a controversial statement coming up from the framework perspective: the imposition of a psychiatric diagnosis is a form of ideological power. These are not evidence-based labels. If they were, we wouldn't need to put all these efforts into replacing them. They very often work to the advantage of more powerful people, organisations, businesses, professionals and interests, and to the disadvantage very often of the people who are so labelled, because on the whole our current mental health systems tend to create rather than cure disability, in our view. How did it affect you? I won't go through this in detail because it's kind of the logical opposite of power. If we think about power, we almost inevitably are thinking about, well, what effect does that have in your life? So we'd want to think about these areas, some of which we probably do, some of which we may be less aware of. And these areas, again and again, one of the areas we may tend to overlook is threats to people's values, meaning making, the encouragement they have or may not have to make their own meanings and values out of their own lives without having other people's meanings imposed on them. What sense did you make of it? The third question: any therapist will be very much aware of meaning as a central aspect of how we make sense of people's distress or support them to do so. And that's true of the framework, but we also wanted to take meaning more broadly than it's often understood. We are arguing that it's too often individualised, seen as a matter as your negative cognitions or whatever that may need adjusting, whereas actually personal individual meanings don't come from nowhere. Our personal meanings, as we've already said, you can see how these are kind of iterative circular questions in a way, come from wider discourses and understandings, which in turn are very often driven by ideological meanings and are filtered down, often in the form of deeply held feelings of shame or guilt or deficit or inadequacy, often reinforced by diagnostic understandings, which at the same time make it more difficult for people to make a connection between what's happened to them and how they feel. And finally, what did you have to do to survive? This covers the area that in psychiatry is often called symptoms, although threat responses, in our view, our understanding, are wider than symptoms as such. They may include socially valued responses like, let's say, working too hard, and so on. So threat responses are on a spectrum, from more biologically based ones like flashbacks, nightmares, panic attacks, and so on. So the framework includes the role of the body, but it includes it, as does trauma-informed practice, in fact, very much as a mediator and enabler of distress, not as in any simple sense causing distress. And a very core purpose of the framework is to restore the links between threats and threat responses, or another way of the same thing is to restore the links between personal, family, group distress and wider issues of social injustice and inequality. And this is a curious thing because at some level this is common sense for all of us. We all know, for example, that people who live in poverty are more likely to feel what we might call depressed. But at the same time as we recognise these facts, we tend to obscure them in all sorts of ways, personally, socially, politically, by imposing a diagnostic narrative, so we then get sent off down the path of curing the illness or developing new pills for the so-called disorder. So that one of the purposes of the framework is to put that link together in such a way that it cannot be severed by those kind of ideological means. 2 seconds on general patterns. Diagnosis, as we know, is actually in general medicine a process of identifying a pattern in biological dysfunction or function. And we spent a long time thinking about what the equivalent might be in terms of patterns in distress and emotional suffering, which is what we're dealing with. And the leap we've made is to argue that in that case, the patterns we need to think about are those that are fundamentally shaped by meaning rather than being fundamentally shaped by biology. And if you make that leap, it becomes obvious, a number of things become obvious. One is that such patterns will not have precise borders or edges. There can be no such thing as categorical diagnosis or precision medicine in that sense. Although there can be broad, understandable patterns, regularities, which both support and are supported by personal narratives. So it may be helpful to some people to look at some of our general patterns in order to help them think more about how that may translate into their lives personally. So we've identified a rough and an evolving set of patterns which are based on characteristic but not unique power, threat, meaning and threat response aspects, and which are applicable in ways that make it understandable that if we look backwards historically, if we look cross-culturally, expressions and experience of distress may appear very different because, of course, meanings are different. They're different personally, they're different socially, they're different cross-culturally. So we argue that these patterns are evidence-based, but they're certainly an area that we are still involved in further developing. Okay, so the framework wants to go beyond the traditional causal factors that we've just touched on, things like trauma, abuse, poverty, neglect, and so on, to look at factors that are often particularly relevant in marginalised groups. So we go beyond those causal factors. We also need to go beyond those traditional interventions in terms of healing. So we might be thinking about histories of colonisation and intergenerational trauma and all these kind of aspects. And because many non-Western understandings of distress are based on narrative, we have found that the framework, and we've provisionally discussed this with some Indigenous people, for example, actually is compatible. Not that we're attempting to use the framework to replace Indigenous or non-Western understandings, but that it offers a sense of support, respect and understanding rather than what we would see as the colonisation of Indigenous or non-Western understandings by a global movement for mental health. So I'm going to show this slide last, I think, actually. So the reception, there's been very widespread interest in the framework. The website gives us examples of translating its principles into practice in various ways, both within and beyond services, not just services, though, also in peer groups, education, training, policy, and a number of areas where diagnosis is relevant and is a key aspect of the way we think. I have 10 seconds to do my final slide, returning to the theme of narratives, storytelling, meaning-making, universal human skills. Framework supports this understanding. It believes that narratives are means of witnessing and healing both within and beyond services. Many forms of narrative are equally valuable, And we are aiming not just for evidence-based practice, but for narrative truth that makes change conceivable and attainable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnstone. It's been fascinating to see these four presentations juxtaposed with each other. We will now have two discussants. The first is Dr. Michael First, who is a professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University, a research psychiatrist in the Division of Behavioral Health Sciences and Policy Research, Diagnosis and Assessment Unit at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and also maintains a schema therapy and psychopharmacology practice in Manhattan. Dr. First is the editor and co-chair of the DSM-5 text revision, editorial and coding consultant for the DSM-5, and the chief technical and editorial consultant on the World Health Organization's ICD-11 revision project. Dr. First was the editor of the DSM-4 TR, the editor of text and criteria for DSM-4, and the American Psychiatric Association's Handbook on Psychiatric Measures. He has co-authored and co-edited a number of books, including the fourth edition of the two-volume psychiatry textbook, a research agenda for DSM-5, the DSM-5 Handbook for Differential Diagnosis, the Structured Clinical Interview for DSM-5, SCID-5, and Learning DSM-5 by Case Example. He has trained thousands of clinicians and researchers in diagnostic assessment and differential diagnosis. So thank you, Dr. First, for being here, and please take it away.
Okay, let me give just kind of a brief discussion of some of the points made. And actually, obviously this is, moving beyond DSM-5. I think everybody agrees that DSM-5 has many, many limitations, and that's really what's spurring on all of these different approaches. So let me just start with, when the DSM-3 started in that project, it was something that was very few people paid attention to it, because it was, at that time, psychiatry was pretty much focused on psychoanalytic and psychodynamic psychotherapy and thinking. And the DSM-2, which was its predecessor, was this little book that was used mostly for coding. So when APA started work on the DSM-3, nobody really paid that much attention to it. And that's one of the reasons it's so radically different, is because people kind of let Bob Spitzer do what he wanted. And one of the things he did was to make the DSM much, much less psychodynamic. DSM-2 and DSM-1 were much more psychodynamic. So it was a huge surprise to everyone that the DSM-3 took off and became a huge bestseller, really, not just among clinicians, but also among the general public. And so this is a quote actually from DSM-3R, the introduction. And as you can see here, it's written obviously by Bob Spitzer. The impact has been remarkable. Soon after its publication, it became widely accepted in the United States as the common language of mental health clinicians and researchers, and for communicating about the disorders for which they have professional responsibility. And it talks about how it's been adopted by textbooks, etc. And then in the 7 years since the publication of DSM-3, over 2,000 articles were generated about the DSM-3. So one of the points I'm trying to make on this slide is one of the issues is the fact that it has become, it's a common language. So it's sort of, we need a common way to talk about psychopathology and the DSM conditions. And one of the reasons that it was able to do that was the adoption of an atheoretical approach. They tried very hard in recognizing that there were so many different ways of understanding the causes of mental disorders. There was an effort to try to come up with a superficial symptom-based system that would allow people with different orientations to be able to all use the book together. So, even though there's many valid criticisms of the DSM, I want to start with just a couple of things I would consider having the DSM. One is, and one of the most important ones, is it's become a shorthand for facilitating clinical communication about symptomatic presentations. And this is important because some of the approaches, especially the more dimensional approaches, are complicated, and it's very difficult very quickly to communicate what's going on with an individual by using those kinds of, like high top. One of the challenges with high top is trying to figure out a way that clinicians who are used to a categorical approach and see their patients almost in terms of prototypes that Drew Resson and Jonathan Shedler have promoted, how to see patients in a way that just using dimensions and breaking things up. So one value of the DSM that I think anything that replaces it is going to have to really replace this idea of having a central way of communicating. And another advantage, even though the DSM and its validity has been rightly challenged, one of the reasons it's also still used is the fact is that for the past 40 years, most of the information that's collected about psychology and psychiatry has been tagged to the DSM system. So even if you don't believe that schizophrenia is a valid way of understanding patients who have psychotic symptoms, if you happen to have a patient who has a symptom presentation that meets the criteria for schizophrenia, you could figure out how to treat that person because textbook chapters and practice guidelines have used that terminology. So from a purely clinical utility perspective, the DSM is filling a pretty big use. And another thing which any system that is going to replace the DSM has to be able to do is to have be able to facilitate payment and collection of health statistics. The way DSM does that is the US government, and in fact the whole world, has decided to have a categorical approach to medicine. And the DSM has adopted that categorical approach, and moving away from a categorical approach. That's one of the big challenges of how do people work with a system like the ICD, which is required for health statistics in the United States. How do you still be able to practice and not have categories? And there's other things that one of the appeals of categorical approaches is the fact that it seems to mirror the way clinicians practice in medicine. And it, as I said before, the atheoretical approach. Now I put the atheoretical approach in quotes because people have pointed out rightly that having a atheoretical approach is a theory. So there is no such thing. DSM has a very strong theoretical approach. It's just not a theory of how the etiology of disorders. But this approach to psychiatric diagnosis is its own theory, but it does have the benefit of making it easier to use across different orientations of clinicians. Now, of course, there are many limitations which have already been pointed out. There's been an overemphasis in the DSM on superficial symptomatic presentations. All the problems with the categorical approach are, the lack of the boundary, lack of clear boundaries. Multiple diagnosis is the rule. I mean, patients and typically, I think there's a study that showed that the average number of diagnoses that patients get is like 2.5. A big problem is the fact that the DSM categories, however appealing the categories are, they're so heterogeneous. There's so many different presentations which are covered under a single category, it limits its use for both prognosis and treatment selection. So even though I said earlier that if you could figure out what category the patient fits into, you can look up what the treatment is. On the other hand, there's so many different treatments that could be useful for people who fit in that category that kind of goes against that idea. And then the other problem is that the DSM is really not applicable to the wide range of clinical situations. It's very difficult to use the DSM if you're doing family or couples therapy. It's almost impossible. There's very little in the DSM for that. And then the last thing is about psychodynamic formulation. The DSM is clearly not very useful, and that was the core of the development of the PDM, which is the DSM in the very beginning. Even after they got rid of the word neurosis, there was still an attempt to try to incorporate some psychodynamic principles in earlier versions of the DSM. There was a glossary of defenses in DSM-3, and I think it's 3R. There was a scale that was developed about also that for, I think it was DSM-3R as an option. So, but if you look now up to DSM-4 and 5, I think any resemblance to anything psychodynamic has been completely removed. But so therefore you have, if one of the points of the DSM was trying to come up with a common language that could be used by all clinicians, this ignoring psychodynamic is a problem in its utility. So how do we move forward with the DSM? Assuming that it's going to stick around, I think at the very beginning, Sarah made the point that Kuhn, if you're really going to have a paradigm shift to throw away the previous approach, you have to come up with something that does everything that the old approach did. And it's having a lot of the advantages of the DSM, including something as simple as being used for payment. It's hard to imagine just not being able for clinicians to just completely toss that away. So I think acknowledging all of the problems with the DSM and the limitations, I would argue that, and what I think is happening is that the other approaches that have been mentioned here can inform and in fact have informed the additions of the DSM. So DSM-5 incorporated dimensional measures. There's an entire online catalog of dimensional measures that are tied to the different disorders. The actual disorders themselves, a couple of the disorders have been turned into purely categorical constructs into spectrums, like autism spectrum disorder. The alternative model of personality disorder is a hybrid dimensional categorical approach. So all of the work that's been done in dimensional approaches have been, at least can improve the DSM. The diagnostic groupings have actually already been affected by some of the principles of HiTOP. For example, in DSM-5, mood disorders were separated into bipolar disorders and depressive disorders, and that really is because they group separately. And much of the DSM organization was an attempt to follow some of the principles that were discovered from HiTOP. And then as far as RDoC goes, I mean, I think RDoC, the basic principles of RDoC, which is to sort of not base research on these DSM categories because they're really so fundamentally flawed. I think we're all looking forward to RDoC to make some major headway in our understanding of how what's going on with these disorders. So the hope has always been that some of the fruits of RDoC informed research efforts will actually improve future editions of the DSM. Now, one thing that's not so clear is how do we, if we were to want to continue to be useful in all these different settings, which aspects of something like the PDM could be included in the DSM? And it's less clear, and it's also maybe the PDM is such a comprehensive approach for psychodynamic formulations. Having it as a freestanding document may be really the most useful thing for people who work that way. So let me stop, and we'll move on to the next discussant.
Thank you so much, Dr. First. So our final discussant is Dr. Raskin, the organizer of this symposium. And Dr. Raskin is a professor of psychology and counselor education at the State University of New York at New Paltz. He currently serves as chair of the Department of Psychology, which houses the psychology undergraduate program and graduate programs in counselor education and psychological science. In addition to his faculty work, Dr. Raskin is co-editor of the Journal of Constructivist Psychology, and he is also a licensed psychologist who maintains an active private practice. Dr. Raskin's research focuses on constructive meaning-based approaches in psychology and counselor education, especially their applications to understanding abnormality, counseling, and psychotherapy. So Dr. Raskin, please take it away.
So thank you. I want to thank all of you for sharing your work today, because I think it reflects an ongoing commitment to improving the well-being of the populations we all serve. And each of the approaches shared today is appealing in its own way, but I think each also faces significant challenges, and I'd like to briefly highlight the strengths and challenges that I see facing each approach. So let's start with RDoC, which in marked contrast to DSM and ICD is an attempt to be ideologically grounded. RDoC's aim is to conduct basic research on biological and psychological processes with a goal of yielding a new diagnostic system in which diagnoses can be made using observable biomarkers. So the idea is to build a diagnostic system from the ground up, identifying what human biological and psychological systems look like when working correctly, so that observable indicators of when they're malfunctioning can be identified and used to construct a diagnostic system. Obviously, if this were to be accomplished, it would be a remarkable achievement. However, one's enthusiasm about RDoC, I think, likely depends on one's degree of confidence that such a goal is achievable. Which brings us to RDoC's biggest challenge. It's currently a research initiative, not a ready-to-use diagnostic system. Whether RDoC's goal, a biomarker-based diagnostic system that defines disorders mainly in terms of presumed underlying and measurable etiologies, is something clinicians can realistically expect to achieve in the short or long term, remains to be seen. Those optimistic about the effort believe that human behavior will one day be diagnosable using whatever biomarker-driven matrix RDoC research eventually yields. As Sarah noted in her remarks, others see this as unlikely, believing that human problems in living are simply too complex and contextually grounded to ever be captured in a matrix. So to fulfill its promise, RDoC must deliver something at some point that is usable to clinicians, shifting from research initiative to biomarker-based diagnostic scheme. Now let's turn to HiTOP. I think there could be many benefits to HiTOP's parsimony. It plainly conveys psychopathology using spectra dimensions rather than hundreds of categories. However, this strength could also be HiTOP's fatal flaw. Navigating diagnostic constructs dimensionally poses practical obstacles. HiTOP might need something akin to ICD's diagnostic codes to streamline both communication and financial exchanges among clinicians and insurers. Further, although HiTOP is technically ready for clinical implementation, it has yet to be widely implemented in direct care settings, so we don't know what issues will arise when it is. One implementation issue is that HiTOP doesn't yet adequately account for DSM-5 neurodevelopmental diagnoses such as autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disabilities, and it will need to address this moving forward. HiTOP will also need to establish actionable ranges along its various dimensions to guide clinicians on when clinical interventions are warranted. These sorts of clinical decisions are usually achieved using assessment instruments, and HiTOP's measures development work group is busy devising such instruments. In the meantime, clinicians must rely on existing assessment tools that harmonize with HiTOP's core concepts, which is doable, but potentially a little bit clunky in practice. So given how different it is than its more categorical predecessors, I think questions remain about HiTOP's ease of use. Clinicians are likely to find the extensive assessment HiTOP requires more time-consuming and onerous compared to the relatively quick process of selecting a DSM diagnosis. Clinicians are also simply more used to categories than dimensions, as Michael mentioned, and it isn't clear that clinicians are prepared at this point in time to make a switch to a more dimensional approach. But of course, one of HiTOP's greatest strengths is its potential research benefits. HiTOP could influence psychotherapy outcome research by simultaneously measuring effect sizes across multiple HiTOP dimensions, resulting in more transdiagnostically effective therapy. HiTOP's dimensions may be broad enough to capture neurobiological abnormalities that don't consistently appear in category-specific studies of mental disorders. And already, twin studies have started identifying genetic factors shared within each of HiTOP's 6 spectra, and spectra-specific environmental risk factors have also begun to be identified. Now, what about the PDM? I think the PDM-2 is highly nuanced and innovative, with detailed attention to developmental presentations of client concerns. Its chapters are organized developmentally, which many clinicians find refreshing. The PDM section on infant psychopathology has been especially well received, perhaps because the PDM-2 is the only diagnostic manual to distinguish infant psychopathology. A targeted approach to assessing elderly clients is another unique PDM-2 contribution. And the PDM-2 aims to promote better therapeutic outcomes. Diagnosis itself isn't the goal, because mental health clinicians treat clinicians, not pathologies. According to PDM editor Nancy McWilliams, mental health practitioners dislike diagnostic systems that don't account for the complexity of human psychology. Unlike other manuals, which explain what psychopathology people are exhibiting, the PDM-2 attempts to answer questions about why and how they're experiencing it. And on this front, I think the PDM-2 stands out. But can it stand alone as an independent nomenclature? This is yet to be determined. Last I checked, PDM2 diagnoses are only accepted for billing reimbursement, I think, in New Zealand. However, the manual has been gaining popularity in Europe as an adjunct to the ICD and the DSM. And given how integral DSM and ICD are to insurance reimbursement, the chances of PDM2 replacing rather than supplementing these manuals is pretty remote, something its developers readily acknowledge. And although many non-psychodynamic psychologists approve of it, the PDM's theoretical allegiance to, or at least its branding as, a psychodynamic perspective might make it a tough sell for some clinicians. Of course, a psychodynamic formulation doesn't necessitate a psychodynamic course of treatment. Any range of eclectic therapies could be appropriate. However, the extent to which non-psychodynamic clinicians will embrace the PDM still remains unclear. And so, because of the time it takes to get acquainted with the more than 1,000-page PDM text, Alan Francis actually recommended an abbreviated version of the PDM to be developed for use in clinical practice. Therapists who work in fast-paced clinical settings with pressure to diagnose and treat patients quickly may struggle to incorporate the PDM2. Its nuance and depth may be impractical in many clinical settings, unless the psychodiagnostic chart that Bob shared catches on and turns out to be as easy to use as he says. So ongoing promotion, exposure, and integration into clinical practice will be required for the PDM2 to gain traction. Now, this isn't to say that the PDM2 has failed to make any inroads. City College of New York Psychological Center has incorporated it into its diagnoses at intake. Further, the PDM has received international attention with various foreign language translations. So what about the PTMF, which doesn't see itself as a diagnostic system at all, because it challenges approaches that see disorders as individual maladies. Instead, the PTMF reframes suffering in more socially contextual terms. Its reluctance to give people diagnoses points to a difficult to overcome shortcoming, I think, in our current healthcare system, namely that clients must often accept potentially sticky and stigmatizing diagnoses to gain access to clinical services. Although the PTMF will be welcomed by clinicians favoring a non-medicalized approach, some PTMF concepts appear a bit difficult to pin down operationally. As Lucy eloquently explained, PTMF's authors aren't trying to provide a tangible system for clinicians to assess and map client distress. Instead, they offer a broad theoretical framework that doesn't impose concrete steps for generating collaborative assessments. Still, PTMF's definitions of power, threat, and meaning, I think, could benefit from theoretical refinement. Meaning seems especially vague to me, as currently defined in the PTMF, with it mainly consisting, it seems, of a series of emotion-related words like hopelessness, grief, mistrust, isolation, etc. It's unclear how clinicians are supposed to use these emotion-related words to understand clients. So I think the PTMF might benefit clinically and scientifically by borrowing from established meaning assessment tools, such as the REP grid from personal construct psychology or the Q-sort. Now, PTMF emphasizes the social underpinnings of mental distress. It recasts mental health crises as social crises. From this, I think two related concerns arise. First, many clinicians will disagree with PTMF's contention that all or most human suffering should be recast as socially caused. Even those who think social factors are grossly underrepresented in current mental health theory and who resist overly medicalized and pathologized conceptions of human distress are likely to see more of a role for biological and psychological factors than the PTMF currently admits. Second, if we accept the premise that many mental illnesses are best reframed as distress induced by oppression, power dynamics, and social factors, then should such problems continue to fall under the purview of healthcare providers? I think actually some of the PTMF authors think maybe they shouldn't. But if that's the case, then will they still be paid for by insurance companies as reimbursable medical services? These questions notwithstanding, the PTMF offers an important and welcome social corrective to overly medicalized approaches to human distress. So in closing, let me reiterate that I appreciate all the alternatives we have discussed today, Any questions I raise are intended to spur dialogue and discussion. I think too often those of us working on diagnostic approaches have tended to work in isolation from one another, often resulting in systems that appeal narrowly to only those most theoretically aligned with us. I hope today marks the beginning of an ongoing discussion across diagnostic perspectives, such that we can learn from and influence one another, and in so doing, develop a panoply of approaches that can move the field forward. So thank you, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raskin. That was such a wonderful way to wrap up these very diverse presentations. We have about exactly 15 minutes, so we're right on time. I have a number of questions that I would be happy to ask all of you, but I think more importantly is this very brief opportunity to put you in dialogue with each other. So I wonder if anybody would like to ask a question or start us off with a comment or anything that you would like to say in response to your colleagues' presentations.
The same thing happens, by the way, when I teach my classes.
You start us off, Sarah. Sarah Kay.
Should I start us off with the question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start off with a question for everyone. I have specific questions that I could ask each of you, but as you were presenting, I wondered to myself how each of you envision the field of psychiatric diagnosis or the practice of psychiatric diagnosis 10 or even 20 years from now. And I'm thinking not just in terms of how you would like it to look, but how you actually think it might look 1 or 2 decades from now. That's something that I'm very curious about, if anybody has thoughts on that.
Well, I hope, Sarah, it won't be referred to as a psychiatric diagnosis. That's the first thing. Yeah,
Interesting.
I think
So the way I frame the question also speaks to a certain perspective, perhaps clinical diagnosis.
Well, yeah. I mean, what we first encountered was either something that came from demons or the advanced case of syphilis disease. So it has that historical assumption. And if you listen to everybody, we're also talking about understanding and helping people. Like, what system is the best way to empathize and to really be helpful to other people versus trying to identify the name of a particular demon or pathogen. So I think we share that.
I mean, I'll jump in and say part of the challenge with the question, the way you posed it, is to understand what people are actually doing on the front lines, right? So this is something, that Michael First and I have talked about over the years. And Michael's written a lot about this. What do we know about the extent to which frontline practitioners are actually using the DSM as intended? And the evidence is that that's not necessarily the case, right? So you can collect all kinds of data on this, right? Like one thing you could look at is encounter forms. What are people actually putting down? Since that was raised during the symposium as something that we want to think about, right? The extent to which these rubrics help to facilitate, the business of mental health. And when people have sort of looked through those, there's a lot of tendency to put down mood NOS, for example, right? So I remember the last time I looked at kind of these data, it's and we can argue about like what is the meaning of the encounter form? Is that actually the diagnostic formulation? Probably not, but nevertheless, what people seem to put down is kind of a vague description of distress, right? As opposed to the sort of refined ideas that are within some system like the DSM. So it's challenging to sort of figure out your question because it's hard to know what's actually going on right now. And what's going on right now is pretty diverse, right? I think different people coming from different traditions are doing different things. For practical purposes, people will put things down in an encounter form. But when you're talking about how do you sort of do case conceptualization, it's driven a lot, I think, by, the practitioner's sort of background and theoretical orientation and things of this sort, which is not necessarily bad, but it is kind of the fact of the matter. And I think it's unlikely that all kind of coalesces into a single monolithic approach, 10 or 20 years from now. the only way in which I think that could happen is if there was something that was sort of so miraculously effective that there was no way around it. And that just tends not to happen, right, in the history of work on mental health, right? That you discover, the miracle compound that, you put in the water and reduces everybody's levels of distress, right? It just doesn't work like that because these are such complex conditions. So I don't know, that's kind of my reaction to it. Like there's a diversity of approaches, and it's really hard to say that there's going to be one kind of predominant approach, I think.
I given your time frame of what, 10 to 20 years, I think is what you said. I think it's just look back 10 or 20 years. Things don't change that much. I mean, around the edges they are. I mean, if I think the ICD for one thing is going to continue to force everybody to have at least some categorical something, or else people aren't going to get paid. I mean, the system works, unfortunately, serves those kinds of administrative requirements. So that's going to constrain everything. So if you look at it that way, and you see that the ICD is forcing the system to be categorical, and I think what's been happening already is probably going to continue to happen. Some of these other really good ideas are going to be incorporated into the system. I mean, some of them, like the PDM, because that's so tailored to certain kinds of clinicians, then that will continue to be kind of a parallel system. But I assume people using the PDM will have to still use some DSM diagnosis simply to get paid. So, but I think the time scale here is probably going to be something, 50 years would be I suspect would be a much greater change than just 10 or 20.
I think it may differ a bit as well, depending on which side of the Atlantic we are. I'm always struck when I partake in conversations with contributors from the States. I mean, how severely constrained you are by your diagnostic system because of insurance requirements, and we virtually don't have that in the UK, and I think it does make a big difference. So throughout my whole career, I have never been required to fill in a form with a label for anybody. In the whole services, I mean, diagnostic language and sometimes in the background, but I've never taught diagnostic language. I've never used that with my clients. I've never been required to do so. I've never had to fill in a form which had a label on it to get paid. It's a very, very different systems. And I think that does allow freedom. And certainly in the UK, there are quite large areas of practice which do not rely on diagnostic categories or assumptions. And in the next 10 or 12 years, I would hope there'll be more of them. For example, one of the typical way that clinical psychologists in the UK use formulation, I know that's a term used as well, is as an alternative to diagnosis, not an addition to it. That's standard practice. It's part of the division of clinical psychology guidelines that formulation is an alternative to, not an addition to psychiatric diagnosis. Having said that, I don't think diagnosis is going to go out the window in that fairly short time frame. I agree with that, but certainly in the UK, I would hope to see it making gains in establishing all sorts of non-diagnostic practice as having, a bigger territory, if you like.
That makes a lot of sense. These are very interesting approaches. And Dr. Johnson, your comment that you've never filled out a form with a diagnosis on it is really striking from a U.S. Perspective. And I appreciate Dr. First talking about the breadth of the timeline. I think in the back of my mind when asking the question, I was thinking about something like the DSM-5 shift. I don't know if in a philosophical sense we could call that a paradigm shift, a la what Thomas Kuhn was proposing, but regardless, it was something that changed. Dr. Kruger, you mentioned Blashfield's division of approaches based on authority versus evidence, and you mentioned the neo-Kreplinians as an example of approaches based on authority. And it's interesting because at the time, I think, from what I understand, the neo-Kreplinians were kind of seen as these renegades in this larger sea of the dominant psychoanalytic points of view. And so I think maybe what I was trying to get at is do we imagine a shift like that occurring? And listening to all of your presentations, I'm struck by how, potentially with the exception of your presentation, Dr. Johnstone, many of the approaches offered are really complements to or supplements to the DSM, at least at this point in time, and aren't aiming at a large scale or revolutionary shift, at least at this moment.
I think, I mean, from speaking from a PGF point of view, I think the degree of change depends also on our wider political context, because the PT meta-analysis would suggest that a lot of the drivers behind the need to diagnose, essentially people who suffer under our largely capitalist system, that's what diagnosis in one sense is there for. So, this is two sides of the same coin. The more people are distressed by social inequality and injustice that comes along with certain socio-economic arrangements, the greater the need for a diagnosis, and the more people's struggles are hidden under a diagnostic label, the more the economic arrangements are allowed to continue. Now, it is my view that we are facing some kind of crisis of neoliberalism, exemplified quite powerfully both in your country and in mine. What's going to come out the other end, we don't know, but I would hope that a more sustainable green future, economically and in every other sense, would actually have less need for a diagnostic system. Now, that really is thinking big, isn't it? But from a PTF point of view, you actually can't separate out personal distress from the wider socio-economic structures which shape all our lives, often in quite subtle ways and also in very large ways.
That makes sense. Thank you.
One of the things I'd be really curious, I don't know if people are willing to do this, but I'd be curious if people had questions for other perspectives outside their own. Like as you were watching this, were there things you wanted to ask one another?
Actually, I had a question. I was, when the PDM, when you did that presentation, I noticed that schizotypal personality disorder is the only DSM disorder that didn't make it into the PDM. And what was the rationale for that? Was it thought it was made up or what?
It was based on Jonathan Shedler's and Drew Weston's research, and feeling that it's more on the dimension of schizophrenia as a dimensional thing, that sometimes they may not have positive signs of schizophrenia, but the schizotypal traits are still there. So they moved it out from a personality syndrome and put it more on the dimension. Aspects of it could be considered as part of the schizoid aspect, but they really didn't see it as so distinct from schizoid, and they wanted to see it more in terms of the dimension along with schizophrenia.
ICD did the same thing. If you look at the ICD, ICD-11 is doing a dimensional approach to personality. One of the differences between that and the one that was for DSM was the lack of psychoticism isn't in there. They felt that schizotypal disorder is on the spectrum and wasn't part of the system. So ICD-11 personality disorders don't have a personality disorder trait or dimension for that at all. So that, right.
We're all dealing with the issue of lumping and splitting. I mean, we can do these factor analysis and cluster analysis and say, well, they all intercorrelate. So is it really clinically useful or theoretically useful to lump them together? Then another group to get together and say, well, they respond to this psychotropic better than this one. So there seems to be an empirical difference, or they seem to respond more to a cognitive approach than an affective approach. So we're always going back and forth between the lumping and the splitting.
Right, and that's the idea of a hierarchical model that hopefully I was able to convey to some extent, right? There is no particular or unique level at which you sort of collapse the hierarchy, right? So the hierarchy itself is a dimensional construct, right? And so there's going to be different levels that are useful for different kinds of purposes. And for a lot of case conceptualization via one-on-one psychotherapy, some of those details are obviously what's going to matter, right? Whereas from a more sort of public health kind of angle, for some reason, I guess I'm thinking about what you might put in the water, but okay, so something like fluoride goes in the water, helps with people's teeth, right? If there's something like this for internalizing, well, that's, the level at which public health can be affected, right? As opposed to one-on-one psychotherapy. So, and of course, what Lucy's talking about is completely fascinating. I'm really interested empirically in the way in which big secular changes in society affect psychopathology, and I've written a fair amount about that, right? For example, the economic crisis of 2008 to 2010 was not good for people's mental health. And we have, papers based on US samples demonstrating how it has a sort of pervasive impact on, mental health declines. So that whole, everything is in a social matrix thing is very, very important. And that is hard, right? Because that's that makes these studies very difficult when you think about things like neurobiology and so on, how to contextualize all of this within a social matrix, right? If you're trying to understand etiology. So there are challenges at the intersection of all of these approaches. But I guess where I'm going with this comment is that the inextricable sort of intertwining of society and the manifestation of psychopathology, that's easy to miss when you're really thinking hard about the genetics and neurobiology and so on. So a lot of creative thought can stem from this kind of discussion. So I guess it's a thank you to Jonathan for pulling together this diversity of a panel.
Well, no, thank you. You kind of, Bob, were anticipating sort of my question, which is, I wonder ways, I mean, when we're just sort of speculating a little bit or trying to get this conversation going, are there ways that systems like high top, PDM, I think speaks to it more explicitly, at least in terms of what I've read, perhaps at this point than high top, but all these systems, PDM, RDoC, high top, can they attend to, how might they attend to or incorporate the social, the contextual? Because I do think that these systems, I mean, and RDoC, for example, I think tries very hard to sort of say, hey, we care about context, but when you read a lot of it, it tends to sort of gravitate back to neurobiology and things wrong with the individual. And so I'm curious about how these systems can, in a meaningful way, kind of balance what seems to me to be kind of a person's social interaction. And I think they both need to be in these systems, and yet these systems still very much gravitate towards its pathology in the person. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how 10, 15, 20, 50 years down the line that might be better accounted for, and what we might do now to help address that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very, when RDoC was first launched, we really took a very hands-off approach to talking about development and environment. And that was probably a strategic mistake, because that sort of hands-off approach of not specifying any domains or factors related to development or environment was taken to mean, well, we don't care about that, when actually it was meant to give researchers the maximal latitude to define what they thought was important and measure and test it in the ways that they wanted. And we do see more RDoC grants focused on development and fewer, for sure, focused on environmental factors. And that's a conversation that feeds into a broader conversation at the NIMH about those types of factors and social determinants of health. So at the RDoC level, we've struggled with, well, do we put out there some articulation of the environmental factors that we think would be most fruitful to study in an RDoC way, but then you end up with the reification of those factors. And there are many ontologies of environmental factors already out there, so we wouldn't want to be duplicative of those or contradictory. But then there, as I said, there's a larger conversation happening at the NIMH about shifting away only from looking at individual factors to other social determinants of health. And I look forward to seeing how that conversation plays out and in conjunction with RDoC and other institute priorities.
That sounds like a very welcome development in one way, but I guess if I can be provocative, this is why I'm usually invited on panels to be provocative, is to say that from a PTMF point of view, that's not going nearly far enough, because if it's still framed in terms of social determinants or causal factors for pathology, then that's exactly where we would part ways with you, because we would see this not as pathology or psychopathology, but ultimately as understandable responses to life circumstances, indeed as adaptive and necessary survival strategies, which, as trauma-informed approaches would have it, are to be witnessed, honoured and validated. And yes, maybe people need to find ways on from them, but they are absolutely the opposite from pathology. We don't believe in psychopathology, basically.
Yeah, I think your comment reminds me of the US Food and Drug Administration. They have a strong emphasis on feeling, functioning, or surviving, that they care about regulating things that affect how one feels, how one functions, and how one survives. And I actually think that view is probably pretty consistent with what you're saying. I think it's a non-pathologizing way of thinking about, well, how is somebody feeling? and how are they functioning. Of course, that brings always a judgment of what's an acceptable or optimal level of functioning and so on. But it's a nice, to me, it's a nice broad way of thinking about it rather than in terms of pathology per se.
That's a big improvement, and language is important. We're obsessed with language in the framework. It's so important from our point of view not to use any terminology that implies a model, which from our point of view we don't agree with. Feeding and functioning is a big improvement.
Does anybody else have questions for one of the other presenters?
I did notice one thing, Dr. Kruger, you showed a figure that was kind of similar to something I presented with the dimensions with a cutoff. And I'm interested in this idea that so many of the decisions that clinicians make are dichotomous decisions. And as Dr. Frost also mentioned, at some point there needs to be, for many decisions, a cutoff or a threshold or a criterion, so that, similar to what we use for, to treat high blood pressure or high cholesterol or not. It's a dichotomous decision. And when I think about RDoC and the goal of attaining empirically based cut points and thresholds and decision rubrics, it starts to feel kind of overwhelming when you think about the number of different kinds of decisions, whether to increase monitoring, how frequently to see a patient, whether to treat with medication A versus B or psychotherapy A versus B, or a more general approach to treatment. It starts to feel kind of overwhelming. Like, how do we ever define thresholds and cutoffs for so many different kinds of decisions? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
I mean, so the way I think about it sort of personally, I guess, as a clinician, is that you're always tethering sort of an intensity of intervention to an intensity of presentation. And that's kind of how clinicians function anyway, right? So the treat or not treat thing is sort of I've never encountered clinicians who really sort of think in quite those terms, right? It's like, well, okay, you're one symptom below the cutoff, so we're just going to send you away, right? It's more like there's a kind of ordinal scale of intensity of interventions that are available that naturally tethered to kind of an intensity of presentation. And the best example I can always come up with is sort of substance use stuff, right? If you present with, peripheral neuropathy, right? Okay, well, we got to deal with, sort of the medical complications of alcohol use before we can do anything else. If you've lost, kind of contact with family and friends, and you're drinking a lot alone, well, then like day treatment is maybe necessary, but you wouldn't worry as much about medical intervention if there wasn't medical comorbidity there, right? And then, some people can be, for alcohol as an example, safely detoxed at home if they have good social supports and this kind of thing, right? So there's like an intensity of things available that corresponds roughly to the intensity of presentation for a domain that's unequivocally dimensional empirically, right? So DSM-5, is a good example of, okay, it recognizes that, right? So there's ways in which the whole DSM enterprise has moved to these more sort of ordinal dimensional kinds of approaches, substance use being a really clear example of that, right? So now there's sort of mild and moderate and so on in terms of gradations on that. So I guess that's kind of how I think about it, right? And if you had to lay that out in a treatment manual way, I think you would do something like a flow chart, right? It's right, it's sort of here's the input data and here's kind of things you might think about doing given these input data. And these things are not foreign to people. It's just kind of laying it all out, right? The MMPI, to pick an example, right? That has a long tradition of kind of like, here's how you think about people who are at different levels on these scales. I don't know, but that's just me personally. Like there's a whole bunch of people involved in High Top, and I'm not one of them because I have other stuff I need to do with my time. But there's this whole like clinical group that's really thinking this through and presenting, sort of manualized kinds of approaches that help with that kind of question that you're asking about sort of level of presentation tethered to level of intervention, something like that.
Yeah, and I think that feeds back to Dr. Kamen's original question of what do we envision in the future. I think more in terms of 30-year timeframes where we would have something like a decision tree that's maybe informed by a wider variety of different types of measures, a behavioral battery that one could use as an initial an initial screening assessment or clinical assessment and make decisions from there.
Yeah, and it's
with
again,
increasing
I mean,
levels of intensity.
I could go on and point out that that's not unusual in other areas of medicine, right?
Sure.
Like that's a very common thing in other areas of medicine. So it's just kind of a matter of pulling this together and developing it because there's enough people with enough of a sustained interest and their support to kind of develop this approach.
Yeah.
So that, I guess that is a hope for the future. We were talking about hopes for the future. I think that's very manageable and tractable. It just requires a workforce of people who kind of want to develop that kind of thing, I think.
Yeah.
Then when it comes down to getting people to use that approach, that's where you want to get the government and the insurance companies to have incentives to actually, because you're right, people are going to do what they want, but it has a huge impact. If it was required for everyone who's doing behavioral treatment to do certain, to administer a battery to get started, if you don't do that, you're not going to get paid anything, then that data will get collected.
Thanks for attending our presentation today. We hope you've learned a lot about diagnostic alternatives, and here's to keeping the conversation going.